The NFL free agency has just begun, so today let's do our biggest winners and losers of day one of free agency. So to do this list, I decided to do 5 winners and 5 losers. We will begin with the 5 losers, and then at the very end, we'll go on to our 5 winners. And to start off this list, we are going to begin with the Carolina Panthers. Now, the Carolina Panthers did make 2, in my opinion, pretty good signings, signing Robert Hunt on a 5-year, $100 million contract, and then guard Damian Lewis on a 4-year, $53 million contract. Now, both those players respectfully are good. However, Robert Hunt getting $20 million a year is a massive overpay. Not to mention, you're also paying Damian Lewis a pretty hefty penny. Yes, these 2 guards will be long-term pieces for your offensive line. However, you're paying these guys for the next 4 to 5 years. And then, in my opinion, the worst thing that happened to them today was losing out on Frankie Louvu to the Washington Commanders on a deal that I personally thought they could have easily matched. And of course, the big news of the day was them trading Brian Burns to the New York Giants. And while I don't really dislike the move for Carolina because they were kind of forced to, they also could have had 2 first-round picks and a second-round pick from LA just 1 year ago. And while I'm not going to put that against them this offseason, for them to only get a second-round pick and a fifth-round pick is a little bit disappointing. But let's go ahead and move on to the Miami Dolphins, who respectfully had a really hard time. This is the result of what happens when you go all in free agency a few years ago and get nothing from it. This Miami Dolphins team has so many players who are making a ton of money, and they had to make a lot of big-time cuts. Some of those guys were guys like Brandon Jones, who's now on a new team, Xavier Howard, and now they're going to be losing out on a lot of really good players. Robert Hunt just got paid. Connor Williams is likely going to go somewhere else. And yes, they decided to sign a new linebacker in Jordan Brooks, who I think is a good player. They've also lost both their starting linebackers from last year, so they have a lot of positions to fill and not a ton of money to pay. And one of the hardest things and the hardest decisions they have to make is going to be on the Tua Tagovailoa contract, a quarterback who, in my opinion, is not nearly close to $200 million, yet will likely get paid that money because they essentially have to, or else they're screwed. I kind of feel bad for Mike McDaniel because I respect them going balls to the walls, bonkers with a lot of these big time moves like Bradley Chubb, Tyreek Hill, and Jalen Ramsey, so on and so forth. However, with that mentality, it shows yet again that free agency sometimes can be a little bit overrated, and sometimes making big time trades for big time players can also hurt your team in the long term. When your respective team isn't making a ton of moves, just remember it's probably better than being the Miami Dolphins right now. Let's now move on to the only team in the NFL who did not make a single move, the Dallas Cowboys. It was a very bizarre day for the Dallas Cowboys as they lost 3 key contributors on both offense and defense, and then had their chance to fill in the running back position, and then didn't want to spend $4 million on a very good running back. On the day, they lost Tony Pollard to the Tennessee Titans, which, by the way, is kind of a weird deal. I don't really get why Tennessee got him, but respectfully, they did. And then they lost to the Washington Commanders, both Tyler Biadasz and Dorrance Armstrong. All 3 of those guys were key contributors for them. Dorrance Armstrong was not necessarily a starter, but he was a key contributor on the defensive line. Tyler Biadasz and Tony Pollard are both Pro Bowl level players at their own respective position, and Dallas couldn't afford to pay them. Dallas has been, in my opinion, way too patient with the Dak Prescott contract, and had they already got that deal taken care of, they could have potentially brought back some of those guys. Not to mention, as I said earlier, they haven't made a single move on the roster yet. They haven't signed anybody, they haven't re-signed anybody, they haven't extended nobody, they've done nothing. And they were going to get Zach Moss, but they didn't want to pay him $4 million, even though he's easily worth that money. And while I do understand that Dallas is being patient with this process, and they probably don't want to overspend money on players who are getting overpaid right now, for them to make 0 moves is, in my opinion, very questionable. And then you have the Cincinnati Bengals, who respectfully haven't had the worst free agency. However, T. Higgins just requested a trade, and that is a huge loss for them. As it sits right now, they've only been able to re-sign a couple players like Drew Sample, Travion Williams, and Cody Ford, and they also did a couple exclusive rights tender. However, they also have a ton of players like Chidobe Awuzie, Tyler Boyd, and Jonah Williams who are going to be going to new teams. Also, shout out to Chidobe Awuzie for getting a nice contract in Tennessee. That being said, the Cincinnati Bengals have not really made any big time moves, and as I said, T. Higgins is potentially out the door. And for me, it kind of feels like the window of opportunity for the Cincinnati Bengals to compete for championships is slowly fading away. They had a chance to win it when they faced the LA Rams in the Super Bowl, but since then, they just can't stay healthy, or they just can't keep the pieces together to go for that other championship run. And while they're not totally collapsing, for example, like the Miami Dolphins or even the Buffalo Bills, they are losing more pieces every single day, and it seems like this team is going down a direction they don't want to go down. Obviously, they wanted to keep T. Higgins as they gave him the franchise tag. However, it's very obvious that he wants to get a long-term contract, and respectfully, I understand. So unless they can find a way to bring back T. Higgins, I gotta put them in the losers category. And then the last loser of the video before we move on to our winners is going to be the Chicago Bears. So as it sits right now, they just signed Kevin Byard and DeAndre Swift, and while Kevin Byard is going to be a nice replacement for a guy like Kareem Jackson in the safety position, he's also older and just not the same guy that he was a few years ago. And then of course DeAndre Swift is one of the more overrated running backs in the league. Let's be honest, he's just not a very good pure running back, and they already have guys like Khalil Herbert and Roschon Johnson, so it's just very questionable. But the big reason why they're on my losers bracket is, what the hell are they going to do with Justin Fields? It almost feels like Justin Fields was a prized possession at one point, till now it seems like nobody wants him. As it sits right now, the only teams that have probably any general interest in Justin Fields would be Denver, maybe Seattle, maybe the Giants, and maybe the Minnesota Vikings. However, it feels like every single team has kind of figured out their quarterback position long term, and Chicago's inability to find a trade for Justin Fields has caused them to hold on to him longer and longer. And there's sort of a part of me that kind of wonders if they can't find a trade partner for Justin Fields, if they just decide to keep Justin Fields and draft Marvin Harrison Jr. #1. Or maybe they could trade Caleb Williams or the first overall pick to another team such as the Minnesota Vikings or the Raiders. All in all, I have a lot of questions about what their long-term future is with the quarterback position, and they did not answer any of those questions today. Let's then move on to the winners category. We are going to begin with the Las Vegas Raiders. So the Las Vegas Raiders had a very interesting day. They just signed Gardner Minshew onto a 2-year deal. I don't know what that means for the quarterback position. Will he be the long-term starter? Will he be the backup like he was to Anthony Richardson? I personally hope that's the case, but we'll have to wait to see. I think this one is sort of an incomplete grade, but I do want to give them a big W for signing Christian Wilkins. Again, we're going to have to wait to see what they do at the quarterback position at the draft. Ideally, you go out there and get a guy like a Michael Penix or a Bo Nix or hell, even a JJ McCarthy to sit behind a Gardner Minshew for a couple games, and then eventually they get the starts. But in my opinion, you're always going to be a winner when you get the best player in free agency, and in my opinion, that's what the Raiders did with Christian Wilkins. He's an elite pass rusher and elite run stuffer, and you put him alongside Tyree Wilson and Max Crosby, that could generally be one of the best defensive lines in the league. And for the Las Vegas Raiders, a lot of people had them going for Byron Murphy in the draft, but now they can move on to other positions of need, such as maybe a tackle or a cornerback, or hell, even at the quarterback position. In my opinion, they've done a very good job at spending their money at this point of the offseason. I'm excited to see what they do moving forward. Next up, we have the Washington Commanders, who I've heard a lot of people kind of give them some crap about some of the signings they've made. However, I think all the signings they've made have been very good. We'll start off with the Austin Eckler one, which is probably the one that gets the most memes about. Yes, Austin Eckler is not this fantastic running back who can do it all. He's not a traditional running back. He's a pass receiving scat back type of guy. And I feel like alongside a guy like a Brian Robinson, I think that's totally fine. You lose out on a guy like Antonio Gibson, so what? We can replace him with Austin Eckler. Eckler's also the veteran's veteran on a team that is going to be very young with potentially a Jaden Daniels or a Drake May. So why not go out there and get a reliable running back who's not going to cause any controversy and isn't going to cost us a ton of money? Then they went out there and took 2 Cowboys players. They took Dorrance Armstrong and Tyler Biadasz. Tyler Biadasz will fill in a major position for them at the center position. It was one of the worst center positions in the entire NFL. Tyler Biadasz is a Pro Bowl level center, so he's going to fit in very nicely there. Then they got Dorrance Armstrong to fill a major need in the edge rushing department. Is Dorrance Armstrong going to get you 10 to 15 sacks? Probably not. However, it's still to be determined because he's always been the backup behind Micah Parsons and DeMarcus Lawrence. So for Dorrance Armstrong to fit naturally in Dan Quinn's system, which is obviously the system he came from, it's just going to be night and day for him, and he's going to get a lot more opportunities to get a lot more pressures. But for me, the big signing of the day was Frankie Louvu on a very cheap deal. In my opinion, Frankie Louvu could be almost the mini Micah Parsons of that defense. Now, do I think he's going to spend every single down as a true edge rusher? No. But at the same time, I also wouldn't be too shocked if Dan Quinn decides to throw him out there as a pass rusher here and there. This was a linebacking core that isn't necessarily bad, but with Frankie Louvu, the defense has so many different opportunities to be really dynamic and really different. But now let's move on to the Philadelphia Eagles. It feels like every single time we have a free agency period, you almost always have to throw the Philadelphia Eagles in the mix. They're one of the few teams that can just consistently find quality players in free agency and not overspend money and not seriously handicap their salary cap table. They brought in Saquon Barkley on a pretty cheap deal. Is Saquon Barkley the same guy that he was all the way back when he was drafted? No. However, he's still an extremely good running back who's going to play fantastic in that behind that offensive line. And yes, potentially going to be losing out on some guys on the defense such as a Josh Sweat or maybe a Hassan Reddick. However, they found a guy who could easily replace them in a Bryce Huff. Is Bryce Huff a tad bit worse than Josh Sweat? Maybe. I think it's a very good debate to have. But with Bryce Huff not having many opportunities down there with the New York Jets, I really do wonder how many opportunities he will get with the Philadelphia Eagles. If Philadelphia is willing to give him a full-time workload, I'm excited to see what his potential could be. With that being said, Philadelphia does still have a ton of question marks, mainly in the linebackers and the secondary room, so we'll have to see how they fill out that roster. However, they have answered some of their question marks as of right now. Next up, I want to talk about the Minnesota Vikings, a team that honestly I had in the losers bracket until I kind of reviewed all the moves they made, and as of just when I'm making this video, just brought in Aaron Jones. So on the day, they brought in Blake Cashman, Jonathan Grenard, Aaron Jones, Sam Darnold, and they also bring in Andrew Van Ginkel. They also were able to re-sign some of their offensive linemen, and low-key, they're putting together a nice squad. Now, yes, they don't have the quarterback position necessarily figured out. Yes, they signed Sam Darnold, but I don't see him being the quarterback next year. Maybe he is, I could be wrong. But for this team, they didn't want to pay a Kirk Cousins 4 years, 100, whatever he got, when he's coming off a torn Achilles. Now, we'll talk about Atlanta here in a second, spoiler alert, but I understand where the Minnesota Vikings are coming from. They already have to pay Justin Jefferson, so why would you pay a guy who just tore his Achilles? Not to mention, it's a pretty good quarterback class, so I would imagine that they are going to be interested in moving up for a Caleb Williams or a JJ McCarthy or whoever. But overall, based off of day one, you brought in a new star edge rusher, you brought in 2 new linebackers, and you just brought in a very good running back. I like what they've done so far. I'm very intrigued to see what they do at the quarterback position because that's a team that can low-key contend for the NFC North based off what I'm seeing. But then lastly, we gotta talk about the Atlanta Falcons. Yes, is bringing Kirk Cousins a tad bit risky? Yes, he's coming off a torn Achilles. However, I'm just not that concerned about the torn Achilles. He's somebody that has never really relied on his legs, and he's always kind of been a statue in the pocket, but now he's just going to be even more of a statue. He's always been someone who can throw the ball deep down the field and make big time plays, and when you have guys like Drake London, Kyle Pitts, and Bijan Robinson, he's going to be able to do just that. Not to mention, this is going to be a Falcons team that is really going to be suited for a guy who just came off an injury. They have a good offensive line and a very good run game. So if you're a fantasy owner, hey, Bijan Robinson might be a damn good play in the first overall pick. And now, because they made this move so early, they can focus on other key positions like the edge rushing department as well as in the secondary. So shout out to the Atlanta Falcons as they just signed Kirk Cousins, who, by the way, I did predict was going to be their future quarterback a couple days ago, or I think a couple weeks ago. Check out that video. But in totality, I thought they had a very good day. Now, it is way too early to tell what the rest of the free agency process will have for us. I will be making update videos as we go along. Hopefully, we get even more news in day 2, and hopefully, as time goes along, we can figure out where guys like Danielle Hunter are going. But if you enjoyed the video, hit the like and subscribe button. I love you guys. Peace.